Hi, welcome to the webinar. Just wanted to let you know that we're not going to be using the raise hand or the chat feature due to the number of attendees. So participants will be on mute for the duration of the program, but we do want to hear from you. So after the talk, there's going to be a question and answer session. And for that, we invite you to use the Q&A feature, which can be opened by clicking the Q&A icon on your toolbar. Then you can type in questions there. If you'd like to be identified, please begin your question with your name. And if not, anonymous questions are fine too. We'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible, but if there are some overlapping themes, we might combine those for efficiency's sake.
Perfect. Okay, let's get started. Good evening, everyone. We're excited you could join us tonight. Welcome to Equinox Part 2, the final event in a two-part program celebrating the installation of Tony Smith's Equinox in the Bridge Building for Laboratory Sciences at Vassar College. This program was developed by the Francis Lehman Loeb Student Advisory Committee, which I am a part of, as well as Jordana. Our mission is to thoughtfully, passionately, and effectively liaise between the Vassar student body and the museum, while acting as a bridge to academic departments, campus organizations, the Poughkeepsie community, and the broader public. The Student Advisory Committee was tasked with installing Equinox on campus in the fall of 2019 by the Loeb's director, Martin Thurber. This was an exciting new opportunity for all of us, as we had never taken on a project of this type before. We were involved in all aspects of it. Working closely with the director and Loeb staff, we quickly learned the intricacies of planning and programming public art on campus. We're excited to present our work to you tonight and speak with two of the many experts we consulted with in the course of this process. Before we go any further with introductions, we would like to show you a video. This was part one of our Equinox programming, an Instagram live tour of Smith's sculpture in the Bridge Building. In the video, student committee members give background on the sculpture and why we chose to put it in its specific location. And Jordana will share that video now.
Welcome to the virtual tour. Hello, and welcome to the virtual tour of Tony Smith's Equinox. My name is Annie, and I am a senior on the Loeb committee. I am also serving as one of 3 co-chairs for the academic year. To give a little bit of context, the Student Advisory Committee at the Loeb acts as a liaison between the local Poughkeepsie community, the Vassar student body, and the museum administration. So typically we plan programming and conversation with the art. And so this was really a project that was kind of outside our normal responsibilities that was entrusted to us by the museum director, Bart Thurber. And it was really cool that he just let us take the reins on it, because normally we don't do installation work. And under normal circumstances, we would be doing kind of a larger celebratory event to introduce the sculpture, as you can see behind me at the bridge. But currently, due to COVID-19 regulations, the campus or bridge is not accessible to those outside of the Vassar community. But in the future, we hope that you'll be able to see it in person, because this is now a permanent installation here. So now we're going to walk in.
Hello, I'm Jack Mahoney. I'm a junior on the committee, and I'm going to give you a brief introduction to Tony Smith and the sculpture Equinox. So Tony Smith was an American architect, sculptor, and educator, and he's most famous for the large sort of geometric sculptures that he made in the 1960s and the 1970s. And Equinox is part of that group. So basically what Smith would do is he'd take these very sort of simple geometric forms, and then he'd sort of expand them outwards into these very complex, very dynamic, three-dimensional forms that sort of were meant to sort of muddy the line between object and monument. And so the sculptures, like Equinox, are very interesting, because as you walk around them, they sort of change in their shape, and they're not exactly what you sort of expect them to be. And sort of in their very dark color and this very interesting play of sort of form and space, they were sort of meant to become these like voids that were meant to sort of stand in the environment and sort of create this very interesting sort of like sort of void within the environment that sort of questions it and reacts with it. And that sort of touches on some Smith's spiritual occupations, because in this play of sort of form and space, it sort of speaks to this interesting play of sort of being and non-being, which sort of touches on Smith's interest in Zen Buddhism. And Smith was also very interested in sort of the ancient monuments and nature. You can see this in sort of the title of the sculpture Equinox, which of course references the astronomical phenomena when sort of the day is equal to the night, and also when the sort of the plane of the equator of the Earth passes through the center of the sun. You can kind of almost see that represented in the form of the sculpture itself, and sort of its very symmetric form, and also this interesting perpendicular axis, which is sort of like how the sort of, if you were to draw a line from the center of the sun, it would pass through at a perpendicular angle through the axis of the Earth. So in this way, Equinox not only like sort of references a natural phenomenon, it sort of represents it in a way that's very similar to ancient monuments like Stonehenge, which Smith was very interested in because he sort of wanted to create monuments that, like these ancient monuments, sort of spoke to a cultural zeitgeist. And so placed here in this sort of very beautiful architectural space with this beautiful natural space right outside the window, it really allows this sort of interesting sculpture to interact in a very dynamic way, and allows you to sort of look at it and question it and see how it sort of interacts with its surroundings.
I'm Emma, also a junior on the committee, and I'm going to talk to you about how we chose the bridge building as a place for this wonderful sculpture. So initially, based on the locations of other Tony Smith sculptures, we decided first that we wanted to choose between indoors and outdoors as a location for the statue sculpture. So we first considered outdoor spaces, for which we conferred with conservator Abigail Mack, who told us that if it was to be placed outside, we would have to treat it, which we decided was not necessarily the best idea, because we wanted to keep it as it is now. But there are some Tony Smith sculptures that are inside, so we wanted to place it somewhere inside on campus in a place where students could see it, as well as other members of our community. Some options were the library and college center and the bridge building, which is where we are now. We ultimately decided on the bridge building because, as the name implies, it literally is a bridge, and bridges, in this case, the gap between the arts and the sciences. And we thought that placing this here would be a way for it to be interacted with by people who aren't only going to the museum or aren't only expecting to look at art. So here it is in this intermediate space where you can walk past and see it. And it's also really complemented nicely by the natural background, which is a nice sort of balance between the outdoor location that we had initially planned or hoped for and the indoor location. Now Jordana will talk about why we placed it in the bridge.
Yeah, hi, I'm Jordana. I'm a sophomore on the committee, and I'm going to talk about the different locations that we considered within the bridge building. So, if you follow me, we can start over here, which was one of the first locations we considered. There were three main ones. So we built a life-size, spray-painted cardboard model of Equinox, and we placed it in different locations around the bridge. And our first location that we tried was right here, because we were interested in seeing how the architecture of the sculpture played against the architecture of the bridge building. But we realized that they clashed with this large X, and the sculpture looked really small under this big structure. So then we moved over here, and we were thinking about the traffic flow in the bridge, and we talked to Professor Tobias Arborst from the Urban Studies Department, and we thought there was a gap in the traffic flow right around this location. And so we thought that this would be a really great place to put it. but we talked to facilities and it kind of impedes in the way. It would be difficult to clean, and we also thought that people might use the structure as a table or a chair, and we obviously don't want that because it's a piece of art. So finally, we settled on this location over here. Originally, this piano was in this location, but thanks to the music department, we moved it over here, and actually, the acoustics are better in this location, so it's perfect for everyone. And now, the sculpture is with the natural surroundings, and you can see it from the inside and the outside. And so we settled on this location, and it looks great here. Now I'll pass it to Annie. Hello again. So I just want to say thank you so much for tuning in to our virtual tour of Tony Smith's Equinox today. I wanted to let everyone know about part 2 of this series on Thursday, November 12th at 8 p.m. EST. It'll be on Zoom with a panel of some very special guests. And finally, I'd like to do some special thanks to various people who just really helped us on this project. So everyone, the staff at the Loeb Art Center, Director Bart Thurber, Mary Kay, our Deputy Director and Curator, and our Supervisor Francine Brown, as well as Abigail Mack, Tobias Armborst, Karen Hines, Teresa Quinn, Michelle Ransom, Eduardo Nevega, Christine Howlett, Joe Tansky, and finally, and last but not least, our class of 2020 alums, who we miss very much, Carly Andreessen, Griffin Pyan, and Ruby Mayer. We hope to see you on the 12th, and thank you for tuning in today.
Great. So again, that was our tour, the first part of the event that we did in part of Tony Smith Equinox programming. So now we're going to get started on introductions and introduce our panelists. But first, let's go ahead and introduce ourselves. I'm Tamishi, a senior on the committee, one of the 3 co-chairs. I'm a studio art major.
My name is Jordana Judd. I'm a sophomore on the committee, and I'm a media studies major with a focus in art curation. And our guests are Mary Kay Lombino and Professor Harry Roseman. Mary Kay Lombino is the Deputy Director and Emily Hargroves Fisher and Richard B. Fisher Curator at the Francis Lehman Loeb Art Center at Vassar College, where she oversees the contemporary art and photography collections, exhibitions, and publications, and provides leadership for long-range strategic planning. She also currently serves on the Contemporary Art Advisory Committee at the Thomas Cole National Historic Site and the Conference Benefit Committee of the AAMC, an organization she has been a member of since its founding in 1999. She's also a member of the Engaged Pluralism, Inclusion, Belonging, and Community Building Through the Arts Working Group at Vassar College. Professor Roseman, can you please introduce yourself as well?
Okay, seen and heard. I'm a sculptor, and I draw a lot, and I do a lot of photography, and I had taught at Vassar for 39 years until now. I don't teach at Vassar, so I've retired this fall, and it's pretty interesting to be in the studio all the time. I also, over the years, have had various jobs, including a few times I was assistant to artists. So I was at one point assistant to Joseph Cornell, and then after that, assistant to Tony Smith. So I have both a connection to being here and to the work, partly because I am a sculptor, I guess a little bit because I knew Tony Smith somewhat, and because I have taught for many years. And, you know, I show and I am in collections and all that kind of stuff.
Thank you so much. Okay, so first off, we're going to invite the panelists to give their impressions of Equinox as a sculpture. And Mary Kay, we're going to ask you a little bit to expand upon that answer by telling us about the process of what it was like to work with the students of the Student Advisory Committee, and kind of where the sculpture was prior to being in the bridge building?
Sure. So I can start with some of my impressions of the sculpture itself. I think of it as kind of one of these very perfect and elegant three-dimensional objects. It's a work that communicates so much, but it does it in such a very concise way, which sometimes abstraction is the perfect medium for that, as well as sculpture. So it's beautifully made. If you allow yourself to spend some time with it, you walk around it, you can really experience some of the beauty of it, the structure, the sleek lines, the luscious surface, the geometric forms. I mean, it's a lot of what the students have so well articulated in the video. And it really does reward slow looking, which is something that we encourage a lot at the Loeb. And I love that the title Equinox both refers to this phenomenon in nature, but also sort of means this moment in which the day and the night are equal, because the sculpture itself has two equal sides if you flip it upside down. So there's something really perfect and elegant about it, almost like math people say that math equations can be elegant. As not a math person, I've never experienced that, but this feels like it has that effect. So just a little bit about the project and working with the student committee. This piece was given back in 1987, and it has been not displayed very much at all and stored in our vault at the Loeb. But back in 2012, there was a moment where I had considered installing it in the sculpture garden at the Loeb. And I actually consulted with Abigail Mack, the same sculpture conservator that the students worked with. And she determined that it really wasn't safe to have it displayed outside in its current state. The welded seams on it could get filled up with water and freeze and then thaw and then create some damage to the piece. And that wasn't something that I was willing to risk. So cut to 7 years later, when Bart Thurber came up with the idea in the fall of 2019 to invite the student committee to take on this sort of new kind of project, as Tamishi described. And I think that idea of sort of finding a proper space to display a work, to really honor the piece and give it the exposure that it deserves, is really like an excellent example of creative curatorial problem solving. It's the kind of thing that curators and museum professionals are constantly working at. And so it was amazing to then have a group of students who weren't trained as curators, but to use their knowledge and their intellect and their studies and also their intuition to figure out the best place to put this piece. So that was just very rewarding experience for me to sort of watch that happen. And I will tell you that Bart and I didn't really have to offer much of our advice. It was really a self-directed project, and it was really nice to see it all come together. So it's very gratifying.
Me?
Yes, please.
I've known the sculpture for a long time, and my experience with it at Vassar was kind of interesting because I was called in to be part of a discussion a little earlier on in this process with the student committee, and Mary Kay was there, and the conservator was there, and there was a real conundrum about where to put it and whether it could, I'm jumping sort of ahead a little bit, I guess, and whether it could stand being outside. And one thing about, amongst other things, about Tony Smith's sculptures, sometimes they're painted black, and sometimes they're left as steel to rust. And I've seen the black ones outside, and I've seen the steel ones outside. And so one thing about seeing this work down in storage, wow, did it feel large? It felt so much bigger than it does out in the world. And so after discussing what should happen to it and whether it even should be altered, one thing I was very both taken aback by and totally impressed by was that the student committee was given, and you can tell me, Mary Kay, if this is true, with the installation, the final say about what would happen with the sculpture. And they were given not only a consultation role, but real decision making. And I thought that was very brave and very interesting. And so when I went to see it recently, where it is now in the Bridge Building, I was restruck by some of the attributes that Mary Kay mentioned, how elegant it was and how beautiful. And I'm also struck with the dichotomy it presents between being totally symmetrical, which usually is a more static situation, and how active it seems when you walk around it. So I thought that was rather masterful, that bringing together of these two kinds of experience. And for me, the pleasure I get by looking at it is to look at it, to have my eyes travel over the surface, slow up, speed up, look at the parts in conjunction with each other, and to have it be a very much an experiential relationship with the work, as opposed to other kinds of metaphorical or depictive kinds of experiences. One thing about this work, it was not always called Equinox. And when Tony Smith was teaching at Pratt, he gave out, besides being an architect, he also, and a teacher, he also painted a lot. Anyway, when he was at Pratt teaching a design course, he gave these geometric assignments to the students. And at one point, he made one or two or some of his own, and came up with his own ideas about it. And little by little, and this is very interesting when it happens to artists, the object he made in his own consciousness, at least from what I hear, we didn't talk about it, it went from being a design exercise to being more than that, to being a sculpture. And at that point, and you can see sometimes out in the world, this very same sculpture, because it exists in more than one form, you could see it both as being called throne and being called equinox. And so for him, I guess, that his titles are pretty interesting. Sometimes they're funny, sometimes they're descriptive, sometimes they're enigmatic. But we can get into this after. When we have a moment, I want to talk about the next thing he did and how it relates to the ongoing body of his work. Also, I would just say this work is made of 2 triangular prisms, no, 6 or 7 triangular prisms, and a couple of tetrahedrons, which is the core of a lot of his vocabulary for the next decades in which he worked. And he also, as mathematical as this work may seem, he worked very intuitively. He made models, he took parts, almost like puzzle building, that he'd put on and take off and try something else until, for reasons known to himself, it looked right. Anyway, I think it's a beautiful thing, and I think it's in a very good place. One thing I was struck by, and I was reminded of it in the label, which I thought was very informative, this relationship between monument and object. It's a small sculpture. I was struck by the fact that the base was white, which made it push towards more objectness. I was thinking, here I am giving advice, if the base was gray, more the same color as the floor, I think that tension between object and monument would have been more to the core of the experience of looking at it. But it does, from far away, it looks small. When you get close, it feels very large. Okay, that's it.
Thank you. I think your comments on Tony Smith are a great transition to our next question, which is, can you tell us a little bit more about what it was like being his assistant?
Well, one thing about being a young artist, which I was some years ago, and getting to work with other artists who you admire, it's a wonderful experience to get to have. And one of the parts of that is if you get to meet someone you admire once, wow, is that hard? Oh, I love your work. Oh, aren't you wonderful? And you make kind of an idiot of yourself. The the chance of getting to work with someone over time makes it a more natural experience, and it's day to day, and uh, you can think of the relationship as being also very described. You know, he's the other person's the boss, and you're the employee, and you're the assistant, and it's very nice to kind of relax to that relationship. I can't say I got very close to him, um, and because it was not a, it was an assistant, but the job took place in their home, so it was very different than if I went to a studio and we had a certain kind of professional relationship, as opposed to being in his house with his family, and that made it kind of lovely, kind of intimate, a little strange sometimes because you felt a little like you were an interloper. Um, but it also, I guess, partly dictated what my chores were. You know, so there was a big version, I'm almost sure, but not positive, of smoke in the backyard. It was huge, made of plywood, and but there was no real work going on at the house, and so I did chores and I worked on the library, and I had gotten my driver's license maybe a couple of months before. And one of the things I wound up doing was driving their new Mercedes from one of the houses they had to the other, which I found extremely nerve wracking. Uh, the other really wonderful thing about being a younger artist and working with for an older artist is that you feel like it extends your time of living, because you wind up experiencing, and especially if the person is well known enough and you know their work, existing in a time almost prior to yourself. And then as you get older and people die, and uh, the older artist dies, you feel a different relationship to history, in a very absolutely real way. So that was lovely. I mean, they were some of my favorite jobs when I was younger, working for other artists. Some people are not built to assist, and some people go with it pretty easily.
Yeah. Kind of shifting back to
I'm going to go get something to drink, so I will
okay.
be for a second.
Well, okay, that works. Because this question is sort of directed more at you, Mary Kay. Shifting back to the Equinox's sort of relationship and history to the Loeb. You talked a little bit about the history of the sculpture kind of in this present moment, but could you tell us how the piece entered the Loeb's collection?
Yeah, it entered the collection in the same way that so many works that we know and love about the Loeb's collection got there. And that is as a donation from an alum. And many of those, if you just walk through our main galleries, are given by women, mostly women who were students at Vassar, classes of this sort of first half of the 20th century, maybe a little bit beyond that. So if you walk through the galleries and you read the labels, you might see the names of women like Blanchette Hooker Rockefeller or Edna Bryner Schwab, Catherine Deutsch. Virginia Decknatel. These are all names of women who went to Vassar and then decided that they wanted to give art to the Loeb, which was, at various times had different names, the Vassar College Art Gallery, before we had our building. But that's how much of the collection came to be. And so this work was given by Marjorie Frankenthaler Eisman, and she was class of 1943. And, she gave us other important works as well. She gave us a Rufino Tamayo painting, a Beverly Pepper sculpture, 5 prints by Robert Motherwell. And you can tell by, sort of the notes in the file that she knew these artists well. There's a note actually on the back, there's an inscription on the back of one of the Motherwell prints that says, to Margie with love, from the artist. And that's where she got a lot of her works, but especially when it comes to these other works that she gave by Helen Frankenthaler, because Helen Frankenthaler was her sister. And we have 3 prints by her that were given by her sister Marjorie. And there's actually a small painting in the collection by Helen Frankenthaler called Orange Painting. And it was actually given from the Roland Peace collection, but we're told that it used to hang in Marjorie's dorm room back in the 1940s when she was at Vassar. So it kind of gives you a sense of, a person who was a Vassar student, but who was already very much involved in art, in the making of art, in knowing artists. And hearing, Harry, you talk about that idea of sort of living before your time in a way. I think that's what was going on with Marjorie Eisman when she was Marjorie Frankenthaler and a student at Vassar. Like, she didn't know that her sister was going to become an enormous artist, or that this piece would be, one of the prize objects in our collection. It was just, a sort of generous gift for her to do at the time. So I love how those stories get sort of woven into the history of the Loeb. And there's so many of them, but I really like the one about our Frankenthaler painting being in a dorm room.
You know what year she gave it to the school?
Yeah, so we got it in 1987.
Because one interesting thing about the Frankenthalers is, and I don't know if it overlapped or not, but Tony Smith taught both at Hunter College and Bennington, and so did Frankenthaler, Helen Frankenthaler. So there were so many possibilities that as all to cross. So the assumption that they all knew each other is not a big jump. Oh, and Helen Frankenthaler was married to Motherwell for quite a while.
Yeah, and actually she gave those pieces as all of the 5 prints that she gave to the collection came in at her 50th reunion. So she was, still giving in the 90s.
Yeah.
Now shifting from paintings hung up in dorm rooms to more public spaces, what do you think is the role of public sculptures on a campus like Vassar? Either of you can speak to this.
Do you want to start?
Why don't you start?
Okay. Well, it's interesting. I've been thinking a lot about the public art that's around at our campus, and not just sculpture, but of course we have stained glass windows, and we have tapestries in the library, and we have, statues for people that are part of our history, like Matthew Vassar or Mariah Mitchell. These are all part of the landscape. But I think when it comes to something like an abstract sculpture like this, it's a slightly different type of encounter. And it's one that I really think is important because there's one thing to sort of deciding that you're going to go to an art museum, whether it's on your campus or out in your community. And that's a very pointed, sort of purposeful visit. You're going to encounter art. You sort of maybe have a certain experience with what museums are like and how people view things in museums, and certain sort of codes of behavior even that are maybe unspoken. And some people feel very comfortable with that and others don't. or just don't feel as though museums are really there for them. But I think that when you take a work of art and place it out in the public realm, or on a college campus, and put it in a place like the Bridge building, where it is literally a bridge, as Emma said in the video, where you are walking from place to place and you kind of come across this work. I think there's a nice sort of pause, and you might, your mind wanders to like, how did this get here? What is this piece? And then maybe the next time you walk by it and you kind of re-encounter it time after time, and you might notice how the architecture of the building sort of works beautifully with the lines, or maybe you see it from outside and you understand this sort of relationship to nature. And I think it sort of seeps in at a slower, more natural pace than the purposeful visit to an art museum. And I think that's an important additional type of encounter that we want to encourage. And I also think it signals for us at the Loeb, it signals to students who maybe haven't been or don't know that much about the Loeb that we do have an art collection on campus, and maybe it encourages them, if they have a positive experience, to come and visit. I hope. That's a plug, by the way. So yeah, those are a few ideas about that.
I would think that public art serves there's a lot of reasons why it's interesting to have art out of the museum and in the public. I would think work on a college campus is somehow inherently different, having work on a college campus, than in a subway or an airport or a public park. And work on a college campus, I think, points to the very reason why people are on a college campus, to think and look and learn. So it becomes another component of not only education, but I don't like to think of art as being there for education. It's kind of creeps me out, but as its main reason, but more for experiences that push thinking. And even if you don't like certain works, which serve another purpose, is if you're someone who tends to not just be dismissive, you start to figure out why. Why does this thing annoy you? Or what does taste have to do with art? And then also, there's certainly the place and the scale, and as Mary Kay was referring to, the work's relationship to the other surroundings. And also the fact that one might ask, what is the purpose of this thing? Does it have a function? And what is function? And function may be much more elusive and complicated once you're not talking about a car or a chair or even a building. So I'm hoping that by and by there becomes more art around the campus.
Yeah, me too. And I think there will be. We have some goals as to what we might do next. And this is a great sort of stepping stone. But I also just want to point out, when you were talking about function, Harry, it made me think of another work that's maybe a little more subtle that people don't necessarily know about. And that is the design of the living room in the alumni house, which was designed by Violet Oakley. And there's a large triptych painting over up on one of the walls. And if you actually go in knowing that she was an artist who designed the room, you get a better sense of it. But I think it's similar to the way that you might encounter Equinox in the Bridge building, because you're not necessarily aware right away whether the piece was meant to be there, if it's designed, the building was designed with this piece in it, which is the case with the Violet Oakley designs in the alumni house. But they sort of become part of the space, and you you can't really look at the painting without understanding that she designed the room and the furniture and did the paintings for the ceiling, and that it's all sort of a piece. So it's both form and function when it comes to that, I think. And those are, I think, best when blended the way they are in that space.
Of a piece and of a time. You know, what makes a work relate to the time it was made in relationship to how it sits in the world at other times later, 50 years later, 100 years later. And what does it bring with it? And does it feel period, or does it feel like it slips by those kinds of descriptions? Because even, go ahead.
Well, please continue. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, strangely enough, we'll go back to Tony Smith. The Tony Smith sculpture, which feels modern, partly because of its abstraction, but also reflects its time somewhat. And the more experience one has with art, the more those conversations come into play and get more complex. And I'll revisit that if it seems appropriate. Tamishi, go ahead. Sorry.
Good. Thank you. So we've talked a lot about surroundings, and I would like to know, if you could place the sculpture anywhere on or off campus, where would you place it and why?
Well, I'll start because I think I've thought about this a lot and for a lot of years when I was trying to find a home for it back in, 7 years ago. But I think actually the first place that I thought of was for it to be right outside in the entrance before you get to the glass corridor, but outside in front of the Loeb. I've always felt as though it would be amazing to have a work of sculpture there, again, to sort of signal that we're an art museum, to sort of invite people in. But I've actually sort of rethought that, and I don't think that would be as good of a spot for it. For one, I saw a car sort of drive almost straight up onto that landing right there, and it sort of bumped into a big pylon that was there, and I really realized that it's not the most safe place for a sculpture. But then I thought, lately we've been using Raymond Avenue as an entrance for at least for the community members during COVID, so that people don't have to come on campus but can come visit the museum on the weekends. And there's this lovely little walkway that goes to the gate of the sculpture garden. And I have thought that it would be amazing to have a sculpture right out on Raymond where people are driving by, and it could be lighted really beautifully at night, and it could just sort of really activate that space out there. Again, not the most practical place for it. There's really nothing that could prevent someone from harming it on that spot. So now I think my most really ideal place is where it is. So I've been very convinced by a lot of what the students had to say about why they chose that space, especially when I was sort of involved when they were deciding on other spaces, and they had this big model, a cardboard version of the piece that was almost exactly to scale, and they could pick it up and move it. And so I've seen it sort of this strange cardboard version of it be placed in a lot of different spots, and it looks amazing where it is. So now that's my favorite spot.
I think that's a terrific sighting for that sculpture. I mean, being in a corner might not be ideal, except it's all glass. So it's towards a corner without closing it in. And I agree that it's nice that, that it's close to nature, but in architecture. So I think that's a really nice space. I think, Mary Kay, you should put a sculpture out on Raymond Avenue. Because one thing about public sculpture, and it can't be helped, you can't have guards watching them, that work that's out in the world 24 hours a day. And sometimes just things happen, and the wear and tear of things is just part of their existence. Like the New York subway system has sculptures all throughout it, and paintings, mosaics, some sculpture, reliefs, and even at the height, it slowed down a lot. Even when things were, and things get marked up now. But one thing that's always amazed me about that work, very little of it is marked. And I don't know if it's some sort of inherent respect people have for the works coming from the works themselves. Graffiti artists probably wouldn't attack other people's work because they're artists as well. So maybe that's why they don't get graffiti. But I'm very struck by what good shape they're all in. I guess the thing to do would be put a work out there that could be cleaned really, really well, really easily. But I think, you take chances. And even though when people are, like we had often for assignments had temporarily put student work all over campus, sometimes more, sometimes less. There were a few pieces that were up for years. One finally, Mark Briscoe got tired of repairing, so we took it down. I don't know, it was probably maybe even before the two of you got here. Do you remember, Mary Kay? It was the top of a house with a chimney.
Oh,
Right
yeah.
off Raymond.
Tennis courts, kind of by Chicago.
Yeah, it looked great, but it was finally getting wear and tear. And then there's a piece that is parts of cars that's up on the power plant near Doubleday, which Fran Ferguson paid to have it permanently put up, and that was a student work. And then there's a brick sculpture when you come down the hill towards past the Avery Theater. It looks like a bed, but it's all made of bricks. And what I'm getting to is with student work, sometimes during what's the big event at the end of the year when everyone gets drunk? The students.
Founders Day.
Yeah, Founders Day. Sometimes the students go wild and the works really suffer. And I must say it often made me angry, but it wouldn't stop me from putting them out. So even on a college campus, even not on Raymond Avenue, things might happen anyway. But it's nice when people don't muck with them.
Okay. Our next question is, how is Equinox affected by the time or current circumstances it's seen in? Or how does our current state of uncertainty, change, and political unrest inform the way we see the sculpture? And does it at all?
You want me to start? You want to start?
You can start, Harry.
One thing that I find very intriguing about that question, and I'm really glad you threw that last part in, or does it at all? Well, of course, the time one lives in affects how you see everything. But I would say that a work like that functions by not involving itself with the politics of the moment and the things that it deals with, which are a fundamental experience of the work itself, ideas of incrementalness, balance, a kind of cold beauty, if one would say that about it, I think makes one realize that there are experiences and things that are not necessarily brought in to issues that are temporal, that come and go, that and politics, disease, war, And something, some objects survive war and some don't. I mean, it's amazing, if we think there's a lot of art in the world compared to how much gets destroyed, there's very little. But I think it's important to be able to have experiences, not to run away from and not to soothe, but that are fundamentally tied to what it means to be a human being, as opposed to more worldly and temporary situations.
Yeah, and I would just add that I think that was very eloquently said, Harry. And I think in addition to those questions are the ones of, what is the power of art to sort of enhance our lives? What do we look to art for? And, as somebody who used to see art, a ton of art every week, and I would go into New York City to view art many times a month, and then suddenly I wasn't able to. And having that feeling of sort of dislocation and alienation of being at home during the quarantine, it really made me understand what art means to me. And it does have an effect of not just enhancing my life, but sort of healing the things that I, couldn't help but think and talk about constantly for the last 10 months. And then there was art, where I could just be with art and think of all the considerations that we think of. And a work like Equinox, which is sort of seems simple, and then when you look closer, you kind of get disoriented by it, because you're realizing that there's so much more there. And I think that sort of interaction is really powerful in a way that sort of takes you away from other issues, maybe even the time that you're living in. And again, going back to this idea of that building being a bridge and the shape of this piece being kind of bridge-like, I think it's sort of symbolic of this concept of how art can sort of have a power of connecting us, and a power of sort of us understanding our present life within a longer timeline, which is always, I think, a good thing to do.
I would also add that art is huge. So there, in my, there's room for all kinds of ways of thinking about art, what it does, how it operates, including art that's overtly political. But then its reason for being made and what it's talking about is very different. So that's one of the exciting things about art. It is so complicated and so huge that art can do various very different things. But one thing about the Tony Smith sculpture is, for me, it does that other thing that I refer to. Also, pretty soon after Equinox, he made a work that was probably even more pivotal in the way art is made and is thought about. And that he made a work called Black Box, which was literally a steel. One was rectangular. There were a few versions. One was cube, but that's what they were. They were welded, plain, cubic forms, and it was a real kind of co-beginning of what people started to think minimal art might be, which was to experience the thing on its own terms and not be particularly referential, which held for a while. I mean, when I was talking about of its time, finally, eventually, all art has its own history. So it refers to itself and it refers to its own history. But for a moment, one could have an art that, and Donald Judd comes into that conversation, that could be about a one-to-one experience of the concrete, of the thing. Very different than political art. Very different. You know. One thing when I was teaching sculpture not that long ago, and issues like this would come up, one thing I would say to students is that a sculpture of a box is literally a box. A sculpture of a figure is not a person. And so fundamentally, that's something big to start to think about and understand when you're looking at work of various kinds.
I think that is the perfect question to end on. So we are going to kind of wrap up the questions from us and go ahead and invite audience members to submit their questions to the panelists. Okay.
It's weird not knowing if there's anyone out there or
not. Actually, okay, we have one from our lovely 2020 alum, Carly Andreessen. Hello, we missed you a lot. And former, yeah, Carly. Also was one of Professor Roseman's students. So I'm gonna answer. She says, sending my warm regards to both Harry and Mary Kay. I'm very curious about the strange circumstances under which this piece has been installed, have impacted your experiences seeing Equinox in person, and how the community has been engaging with it since its installation. So I'm sure that has to do with the strange circumstances, the pandemic, of course, that we all find ourselves in right now.
Hi, Carly, first of all. I want to just say that I think if I were working on campus rather than working in my makeshift home office, I would probably go over and see the sculpture every day. Or sometimes I would park in a place that I would walk through the bridge building, and I would have that experience that I was talking about before, that you encounter and re-encounter a work and you sort of begin this relationship that's a long-term relationship with a piece. And I'm a little sad that that's not happening, but of course it will once we're all back on campus again. But the few times that I have been working in my office, I have made it a point to leave my office and walk over there. It's a very short walk from the Loeb, and I was very happy to see that my key card works to get into the building, and that I could go inside and look at it from outside and see it from all different perspectives, because that is the rewarding thing about its placement. But what is kind of sad is that we don't really know how the community is engaging with it since it's been installed, because as far as I know, there really aren't community members who are allowed to come into Vassar buildings. That's part of the plan to keep everyone safe. And of course, this event would have probably been a big opening where we would invite the public and invite campus, and that interaction between our communities and our different audiences would happen right there in front of the sculpture. Hopefully someday we will get a chance to do that. But those are often the moments that you really start to recognize, all of the amazing work that goes into a project like this. So it's a little sad that we're not able to do that. But the beauty of it is that it will stay. It's pretty much found a permanent home unless there's some reason to remove it from that place. So it'll continue in that place, and hopefully we'll be able to engage with the wider community as soon as we're able to.
Well, I taught a class in that building. As Carly knows, she was in it one term. And I did always very much enjoy heading over there. It's so different from the art studios. Um, I kind of wish it had been there longer. And when I went to see it a few weeks ago, uh, I, I thought it looked great, and I was wished it could have been there over those years I taught there. I think it would have really added something to coming in and out of bridge building. But again, you know, I would get less feedback than you, even Mary Kay, because I'm very rarely on campus these days. Once in a while, but not too often, since I don't work there anymore.
Okay, I have another question from one of our committee members. What is it about Equinox that works so well in its sculptural form? Could this have worked had it been in any other form?
That's an odd question. I don't even know what it means. I mean, it's either itself or it's something else. And if it had another form, it wouldn't be it. So that question kind of confuses me.
I mean, but didn't you say, Harry, that you also knew Tony when he was a painter?
No, he was a painter way before
Afterwards.
I had anything to do with him. I just said I knew he was a painter, and I have seen the paintings.
Well, I definitely don't think this could have been done on any sort of two-dimensional space, right? The whole point of it is about, I think, as Jack says in the video, about form and space, right? That is what the piece is about. But I guess because we've been sort of living our lives online these days, I did think that it could possibly, had Tony Smith, you know, lived in a different time, it could have been created maybe in like a virtual 3D space. And then of course that whole idea of turning it around would be much more vivid and obvious. Maybe that would sort of ruin it because it would be too obvious, because you would know that you would have to turn it around. And that mystery of not knowing when you first encounter the piece is part of the beauty of it. But I think that didn't some of the students create, maybe it was even Carly, that created a 3D version of the piece in a virtual space. And then the students used our 3D printer on campus to create a little tiny version of it from that 3D modeled image in the computer. And then once you had the tiny version of it, you could do that exact thing, is sort of turn it around in your hands and understand it in a way that that takes a lot more effort and work to do when you're seeing it in person. And that symmetry and all the parallel lines and parallel planes and repeating forms then sort of become very vivid in that sort of setting. So I guess if we all were in a, you know, virtual reality space right now and we could look at it in that, it would be probably the only other way that I could imagine it.
It wouldn't be real. When I one of the classes Carly was in of mine was a class I teach with Tom Ellman, computer animation. And first year, Tom and I mostly talked about language and what was real and what wasn't. And I finally got used to the fact that when people talk about the virtual world, the vocabulary that is used, a lot of it comes from the actual physical world. So I've gotten used to that. But at first, it just threw me so much about, you know, and then Tom would say, but the math is real. It was very interesting. But I would say there's inherently, clearly something very different between something that you could trip over and break your neck and something that you're seeing on the screen, you know. I think it's also a little bit like historically when photography was invented. It's a big stretch, this connection, but when photography came around and people thought painting wouldn't exist anymore and that it took the place of painting, well, it didn't. And so inherently, it was a different experience, both the doing and the looking. And so inherently, virtuality is a different experience of the physical, no matter how convincing it gets. And I'm not talking hierarchically, just it's different, you know. One time, I don't know, this seems like from left field, but when I was thinking about how things sit in their own time and what kind of history they bring with them, I wasn't talking about it, but there was talk of having classes in the summer, art classes, you know, like a whole, like I guess film does. And I remember saying I'd rather go without shoes than teach in the summer as well. But I did agree to do a 1-day walkthrough of what was the art gallery at that point. It was it the Loeb already? No, I guess not. Anyway, so there were a group of people who we were going along together, maybe mostly alums, I don't know. I was gonna say older people, more like my age now. And we stopped in front of Walter de Maria's energy bar. It's called something like that. It was just a polished, I think it was steel bar, very minimal. So that's what made me also think of it. And we never got, for the whole 45 minutes, we never got past that object because it made everyone so angry and so mad. And because it was so enigmatic, people thought they were being made fun of. And it was also in a museum. So it took us a long time to talk through the kinds of experiences that one could have, which weren't at first glance knowable, and how the only way, and I'm sure some people feel like that about various Tony Smith sculptures, that the only way to open up to them is not to get defensive and see what they are, what they look like, what they might be, what might be of interest to them, without worrying about being right, you know, and having information. Anyway, that seems like a little aside. I'm sorry. I did see a little video online of some big Tony Smiths somewhere, and people reacting just like that. You know, what is this? Why am I looking at it? What's it about? It doesn't look like, who made it? It doesn't look hard to make, blah, blah, blah. So, you know, this kind of immediate defensiveness rather than, and it's very hard, you know, to open up and say, okay, I'm lost here. How can I at least figure out what's going on without being angry? So maybe that's a little bridge.
Okay, we're going to end with this question. Thank you so much for our attendees for submitting. But this anonymous attendee would love to know, what are your thoughts on the word equinox? And what does equinox, the word and or the sculpture, mean to you?
I think I sort of said a little bit, I alerted to this a little bit before. When I think of equinox, I think of those, you know, those days of the year, which don't happen very often, that the day and the night is the same length. And while we don't necessarily always notice the difference of the hours of the day, we do notice them when the days are extremely short, like in the dead of winter, or where they're very long in the summer. And I think that sort of equilibrium, the moment where everything is equal, is sort of what he might have been alluding to in the title. You know, I think of it also as sort of, it's a natural phenomenon, it's an astrological phenomenon, so there's sort of like science and nature, but also these equal parts. The word just has a lot going for it in terms of how much I like, and it's interesting to hear actually that Harry said that it used to have a different name, and then he sort of changed the name at a certain point to Equinox, but some versions of this piece that take on the same exact form have a different name. So that I think is also kind of an interesting effect, but yeah, I think that it's one of these open words that means different things to different people, and that gives it something kind of for a lot of different people to add their own meaning to it.
Yeah, I would just add that I think titles are really difficult and sometimes open things up, sometimes totally close things down. I don't think, it doesn't make me like the sculpture more. I think I would maybe like throne less because it seems slightly more literal. It's an okay title.
Well, throne actually makes you think that you could walk up to it and sit on it.
Sit on it, yeah.
I don't like that idea. It would be a pretty awkward place to sit, I think.
Yeah, very awkward.
Great. Thank you so much for attending this panel, and thank you so much for being guests on this panel, Professor Roseman and Mary Kay. The webinar is going to be recorded and available on our website. We'd also like to thank all of the staff at the Loeb Art Center, in particular, Director Bart Thurber, Deputy Director and Curator Mary Kay, who's here, as you know, and our supervisor, Francine Brown, Abigail Mack, Professor Tobias Armborst, Karen Hines, Teresa Quinn, Michelle Ransom, Eduardo Navega, Christine Howlett, Joe Tansky, and our class of 2020 alums, Carly Andreasen, Griffin Pion, and Ruby Mayer. Also, you can check the Loeb e-newsletter and social media for future programs. Thank you so much for coming. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Right.